What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we're going to look at how to authenticate with an API using React and TypeScript. So in order to do this video, you have to have an API already working where you have some sort of authentication system that uses JSON Web Tokens. I'm also going to be starting out with a simple React project, as you can see here, that already leverages TypeScript and React Router. If you don't have a backend project with JSON Web Tokens, have no fear. I do have a project for both MySQL and Mongo, as well as a starter project for React and React Router. If you don't want to take a look at those, you can just download the source code for this video and get everything that you're going to need. Okay, guys, let's get right into it. So you can see here, I already have an interfaces folder that has a page interface and a route interface. I'm going to be creating a new interface that is going to be capturing what my object type is going to look like when I get my response from my backend. So let's go ahead and create a new interface file. We're going to call this file user.ts, and we're going to start by exporting a default interface of iUser, and we're going to have 5 variables on here. We're going to have an underscore ID because I'm going to be using MongoDB, a name, an email, and a created at and updated at optional variable, and all of our variables are going to be strings. Now the created at, updated at, and ID variables are all Mongo specific. So if you're using something like MySQL, this may look a little bit different for you. The next thing we're going to do is create a context that we can use in our React hook functions. A context can be looked at as a very simple version of a global state. You can use this in place of something like Redux when you're doing a simple project that you don't need a lot of state management with. I personally prefer using contexts because it eliminates having to use an extra library. So that's always good. So let's go ahead and create a context folder. Inside of it, you're going to make another user.ts file. At the top, we're going to import React with a capital R from React. And we're going to go ahead and import our iUser interface as well. In order to use the context properly, we're going to define a context interface, and we're going to be defining that as an export iUser context interface. Inside of it, we're going to have 4 variables. We're going to have a user that is of type iUser or null, a token of type string or null. Then we're going to have 2 functions as well. We're going to have a login function, which takes 2 parameters, a user and a token. The user is of type iUser and the token is of type string. And these are just going to be returning void functions, as well as a logout function that has no parameters and also returns void. Now, the reason that I have these functions here is because I don't like passing a lot of things down through props if I don't have to. It's better to do it this way simply because you want to try and avoid as many re-renders as possible. It's kind of a hacky way to pass the functions through here, but your program is going to work just fine. And unless you plan on changing these functions over and over again, your user context is going to remain relatively stable. So next, we're going to define a const user context with a capital U, and we're going to make this equal to a React create context. And then inside of some chevrons, we're going to pass in the interface we just created. And inside of the function call, we're going to pass in its initial state object. User and token are going to be equal to null, and the login and logout functions are going to be equal to the exact same things we defined above, but with just some empty curly braces defining an empty function for now. We're going to define this function later when we actually populate this context in React. Lastly, we're going to export 2 variables and then a default. We're going to export a user context provider and a user context consumer. These will be equal to user context .provider and .consumer respectively. And then finally, we can export default the user context itself. So again, I'm using a context here instead of something like Redux. This is just a personal preference. If you wanted to use something like Redux, you totally can. And I'm by no means an expert on how to use contexts, but I've gotten them to work pretty well using them like this. So this is what I'm just going to go with. Now that we have our context defined, let's go to our application file. The way this file works in the context of this project is as the glue that holds everything together. And what I mean by that is all of the routing is going to be done in this file. So any authentication checking or functions or contexts that need to be provided to the entire project are going to be populated here because this is the entry point into my project. So let's start off with some state variables at the top. Since we're using React hooks, we're going to be defining our states as follows. I'm going to start with a const, and inside some square brackets, a user and set user function. And this is going to be equal to a useState. Inside the chevrons, it's going to be either iUser or null with a default value of null. Don't forget to import your iUser interface. I'm going to also define a token with set token, and this is going to be a string or a null, also with the default value of null. I'm going to add a state variable called loading. It'll be of type bool, and its default value will be equal to true. The loading variable is going to keep track of if we're loading the application or not. And what we're going to be doing for loading is just checking to see that if we do have any credentials, to see if they're valid and authenticate them with the backend. Next, I'm going to make a variable called const history, and this is going to be equal to something called use history, which should import from React Router DOM. The history variable here will allow us to actually change our pages without using React Router's redirect, but I will also be showing you how to use the redirect as well. You're going to get both examples in this tutorial. Now that we have all of the contexts and states that we need, what we're going to do is we're actually going to check on the initial load of the application if we have some credentials in local storage or not. If we do, we're going to validate them. If we don't, we're going to just redirect to login right away. So let's take a look at how to do this. In this use effect here, that's called initially when the application loads, after my little logging statement here, I'm going to do some checking. Let's check to see if either the user or the token is equal to null. If so, we're going to have to check our local storage. So how we do that is first I'm going to put a little logging statement here just to see what's going on inside of my console. And then after I do that, what I can do is I can make two variables, an underscore token and an underscore user, and make them equal to local storage.getItem, and then pass in either token or user. These will be the keywords that allow me to store and retrieve my variable, and I'm going to make sure that those stay the same throughout the application. Next, I'm going to see if either of these are equal to null. If so, that means I have nothing inside of a local storage. Even if I have one, if I don't have the other, I'm just going to erase all of the things I have there, and I'm going to redirect to login. So maybe I'll put a little statement here that says, nothing's in local storage, removing my vars and redirecting. You'll see the second comma I'm putting in my logging functions is actually just a little namespace that I have. The reason that I do that is to just keep track of where my logging is coming from. After this logging info, I'm going to add a history.push, and I'm going to make that equal to the /login. That way it redirects me to the login page. Also, I'm going to add a little comment here, call logout function, and that's so that after I define my logout function, that's going to be part of my context, I'm going to come back in and fill it out here. After my history.push, I'm going to set loading equal to false because we don't load the application anymore and we want the page to show up. And now let's move on to the else statement. So if we do find something, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to call the function that we create in order to verify our credentials. So maybe put a little logging statement here if you want, you don't have to. And then after that, we're going to put a little comment here to remember to call our verify function. So let's go ahead and create that function. Go ahead and create a const. I'm just going to call it verify local storage credentials. You can call it whatever you want. You can just call it verify. It's going to be an async function, taking in a token and user as strings. I always put the underscore token and the underscore user because I have a state variable that I don't want to clash with, because if I left it as a normal token and user, it would use the function scope instead, which is fine in this case, but I just like to keep my variable name separate anyways. Next, let's go ahead and make sure that we npm install Axios, because that's the library I use to make calls to the backend or any HTTP request. Once we have that, inside of our function, let's go ahead and add a try catch block. Now at the top, we're going to let our underscore parsed user be equal to a JSON.parse and user. The reason that we do this is when we store an object in local storage, it has to be a string. So we call a JSON stringify whenever we store something. So I know this user is actually going to be an object, so I'm going to JSON parse it right now. Let's go ahead and let our response be equal to an Axios function, and inside of it, we're going to pass an object. Inside of the object, we're going to call our method as get. For URL, usually what I like to do is put this in config, but for now I'm just going to hard code it. And mine's just going to be my localhost, and then the port of my server. Mine happens to be 1337 because of course it is. And my validate root is at users/validate. Now, all the validate root has to do is return a status of 200 after it's decrypted your JSON web token. And again, I do have that in a practice package for you if you haven't done something like that before. After the URL, I'm going to put some headers, and I'm going to pass in the authorization header equal to a bearer, and then space, and then my token. If my response.status is equal to 200 or 304, which is sometimes returned in the case that you call the same root over and over again, I'm going to go ahead and call my login function to make sure that my credentials are saved and my state variables are set. I'm going to make set loading equal to false, and that's all I got to do here. So again, that's just a placeholder before we make the login and logout functions. Else, I'm going to say that credentials no longer valid, and then I'm going to call my logout function. I'm going to make my set loading equal to false, and I'm going to make sure to history.push to my login route. In the case of catching an error, I'm going to log the error. I'm going to pass in the namespace auth. I'm going to copy and paste that up here too. And I'm going to copy and paste my history.push and my set loading after I call my logout here, and just go ahead and copy them into the catch error because that's going to look pretty much the same. So now that this function's finished, we just have two more functions to create, our login and our logout. So let's go ahead and start with our const login, and that's going to be equal to a function that has two props, a user of iUser and a token of string. And all we're going to do here is two things. We're going to set our user to that underscore user, set our token to that underscore token, and then save both these objects in local storage. How we do that is with the local storage.set item. Then you pass in the key, in this case, user and token. For the user, you're going to JSON stringify the underscore user object. And for the token, you're just going to pass in the variable itself because it's already a string. For the logout function, you're going to do just the opposite. You're going to go ahead and type local storage.remove item, both for user and token, and you're going to set the user and token both to null. Now that we have these functions, I'm going to go up and replace the comments that I left with the appropriate functions. I'm going to put logout here, verify local storage credentials here, pass in the user and the token. I'm going to do the same thing down here, pass in the login, pass in the parsed user in this case, and the token, because I know they're good. I'm going to call the logout function two more times here, and then that should be it as far as this goes. Now we're going to quickly check if the loading variable is true. Let's just return some sort of loading statement, or in this case, I'm using React Strap's spinner. After our loading statement, let's go ahead and let our user context value be equal to, and then we're going to pass in our user, our token, and our two functions. And then how we're going to provide that to the rest of the application is in our JSX return down below, we're going to be adding a new component, and it's going to be our user context provider, which you can see here automatically imports with Visual Studio Code. And we're going to pass in a value prop with our user context value. We're going to encapsulate this switch with our user context provider, and then everything inside of that will have access to that state context. So that's pretty much all we have to do for our application page. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a login page and a register page. These pages are going to provide the tools for creating a user and then signing that user in. And how this app is going to work is you'll only be able to visit the home page if you are authenticated. And if you are not, it's going to boot you to the login page. And if you don't have a login, it's going to kick you to the register page. So since the login page and the register page are going to look pretty much identical, minus one or two input fields, I'm going to go ahead and create a custom stylized container for them by creating a new component that they can both share. Since I'm using React, I'm going to be stylizing everything inside of this component. So let's go ahead and create a new folder called components. And inside of it, let's create a folder called auth container. And inside that container, an index.tsx file. I'm going to be defining this as a function component as well, so I have access to the children props. I'm going to start by importing React from React, and then I'm going to import the following from React: container, row, column, card, card header, and card body. The reason that I'm importing these is I'm going to have a card represent our login and our register components, and I'm just going to differentiate them by the card header. So let's go ahead and make our interface by exporting an interface of auth container props. Inside of that, we're going to have one variable, and it's going to be the card header of type string, which is basically going to just be the title of the component. I'm going to create a function component called auth container, passing in the auth container props as you do. Inside of the function component, I'm going to have a constant equal to my props, and inside of it, it's going to be my card header and children. I'm going to go ahead and return as follows. I'm going to have a container. Inside that container, I'm going to have a row. Inside that row, I'm going to have a column, and I'm going to style it as follows so it always appears in the center, and it's going to appear small. First, when the window is of a small size, I'm going to just pass in the size of 8 and the offset of, let's say, 2. And then I'm going to create this for different sizes recognized by Bootstrap, because that is what React essentially is. If you're not using React and you're using, let's say, Material UI or something else, you can stylize this any way you want. But after I create the column sizes properly, I'm going to go ahead and pass in a card inside of this column, which will always be the proper size. And this is how I do it in React or in Bootstrap. So I'm going to create my card component. Then I'm going to pass in a card header component. And inside of that card header, I'm going to pass in the card header variable. And then inside of the card body, I'm going to pass in the children variable. Lastly, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping by adding a margin of 5 to the top of my card. And inside of my card header, I'm going to make the background the primary color and have the text equal to white for some nice styling. I'm going to go ahead and export default my auth container, and then it will be ready to use by both my register and login component. So now let's create our register component. I'm going to copy my home page here, and I'm going to rename it to register. Inside of it, I'm going to go ahead and just change this to register page from home page. And then I'm going to start creating some state variables. So these are the variables I'm going to need. I'm going to need my authing, or you could put authenticating. And this is going to be a use state equal to a bool, and it's going to start with false. Next, I'm going to have a name. Set name is going to be the setter. And this is going to be a string, and it's going to start as empty. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure the rest of these are going to be strings. The other variables that you're going to need are an email. You're going to need a password. You're going to need a confirm, or you could call it confirm password. You're going to create another one called error and one called redirect. All of these variables working together are going to provide us with the functionality we need for a really good working register page. So for the register page, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a function that is going to be called when we click the register button. We're going to create a const register. We're going to make that equal to an async function. Inside of it, at this moment, you could do a little bit of housekeeping, and you could do that by doing some really, really rigorous error checking here. I'm not really going to do that much here for the sake of saving time. So all I'm going to do is check to see if we have an error. And if we do from the previous run, I'm just going to set that error to null. But right here is where you would check for see if your passwords match and you have email that's proper and maybe some regex, etc. So in a try catch block, we're going to make a response equal to And I'm going to import Axios again from Axios. And we're going to await Axios with a function. Inside of that function, we're going to go ahead and pass in an object. And the method this time is going to be post. The URL is going to be whatever your server is and the route that you use to register. Mine is localhost 1337 users register. This is the same as the tutorial I did for JSON Web Tokens. And for data, we're going to pass in a name, an email, and a password. And this is what we need to register properly. If your response is 201, which means that something was created, I'm going to go ahead and just set a redirect to login here. Now, as I mentioned before, you could use that history context provider and you could do a history.push here, but I'm just going to show you how to use set redirect if you wanted to use the redirect functionality. So I'm just going to put a little comment here that, you could also use history.push. That would work here as well. Now, the reason I want to redirect the login is if we're successful in creating the account, let's go try and log in with it right away. If we're not successful, we're going to set an error. You can have any error message here that you want. I'm just going to say unable to register and maybe please try again. And then I'm going to set my authing to false. And then I'm going to copy and paste that and put that in the catch block down below, maybe with a little logging function as well. Next, I'm going to check to see if we have a redirect variable that's not equal to an empty string. We're going to return the redirect component from React Router DOM, and we're going to go ahead and send that to the redirect itself. Now, inside of the JSX, we're going to get rid of what we had here before, and we're going to go ahead and import our auth container here. For our card header, we're going to make this equal to register. Inside of the auth container is where I'm going to put a form group and an input. And this function is going to have 4 of them. You're going to have an input for your name, your email, your password, and your confirmed password. So I'll show you how to make the first 2, and then I'm going to speed up the video for the sake of saving time. So for your name, it's going to be of type text. You're going to have a placeholder. You're going to have an onChange that handles an event. And you're going to set the name to the event.target.value. And you're going to make sure that this input has a value of name. You're going to do the same thing for email and password. The only difference is that the input type for your email is email, and the input type for your password is password. Make sure that both your password and confirmed password are of type password, otherwise you'll be able to see them in plain text. Once you're done putting in all the inputs, let's throw in a button at the bottom. Inside, it could just say register or something like that. What we're going to do is we're going to set the disabled to authing, which means that if we're trying to register, don't let them click the button again or you're going to spam the server. We're going to make the color info, and we're going to make it of type block, which means it's going to cover the whole width of the card. And then we're going to set the on click to register. Inside of it, you could just have register as text. Next, we can have some small text. I'm just going to give it a little bit of formatting here. And we can use React Router's link function to say that if you already have an account, let's just send them to a link that sends to the login page. And then last but not least, we can put a little spot for some error text if there is an error. And to do that, you could just do some conditional JSX like so, where you can check to see if that the error variable is not equal to an empty string. Just include a little small text with maybe the class name of text danger so it appears as red so you know it's an error, and then just pass in the error text itself. Now, if we go back to the register function, I'll show you how to do some of that error checking that I showed you before. Basically right here, you can just check to see that if the password is not equal to the confirm, you can just set an error that say the passwords don't match. That way that the function doesn't work. You're going to probably want to put in a little return statement to cancel out this function. And then this will boot you out of the registering in case you are trying to register with some bad passwords. Like I said, right here is where you do more error checking, maybe with some regex, just to make sure you have proper emails, names, etc. So that's all we need for the register function, and we're going to use this as a base for our login function. So let's move on to our login page, and we're just going to copy and paste everything from our register page, drop it in here, and start renaming things. So we obviously are going to rename the register page to the login page. We're going to delete a couple of variables here that we don't need anymore. So let's go ahead and get rid of our name. We don't need that. We can get rid of our confirm password. We don't need that. We'll get rid of this little error checking for the passwords matching right here. We don't really need that. The endpoint we're going to call instead of the user's register is going to be the user's login, because that's what it is on my endpoint. The data being passed, we're going to get rid of the name. Make sure you rename the function to login. Inside of this response.status equal to 201. First of all, we're going to set that redirect to the home page. We're going to make sure we remember to call the login function. Up here, we're going to use a const user context function. We're going to be making that equal to use context. And our user context, this will provide us the state since it's being provided to us in the JSX of the application file. We're going to call our user context.login. We're going to pass our response.data.user and then our response.data.token, because that's how it's being returned if you remember from the other tutorial. We're going to change these error messages. I'm going to change the 201 to a 200 or a response.status of 304 as we did in the verify credentials. I'm going to change this little namespace to login. I'm going to get rid of the name and the confirm password form groups because we don't need those anymore. I'm going to change the card header to login. I'm going to change my buttons naming to login. And I'm going to change the onClick to the login function. I'm going to say that if you don't have an account, link to the register page. And that's pretty much all you need for the login page. So now that we have everything, I'm going to go ahead here and show you that I've turned on my server. This is proxying my backend for me, and it has my MongoDB already up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to minimize that, and I'm going to type in npm start, which will start a React project. Now, when you do that, you're going to get this type error that says history is undefined. And that's because I used that use history context incorrectly. What provides that history context is the browser router that's defined in our application. So in order to fix that, what we need to do is we need to go back to our application file. We need to get rid of that browser router that's in our JSX return. And we're actually going to go to our index.tsx file, and we're going to put it in there. That way the browser router is providing the context for everything inside of the application and all of its children. And then the history context is going to work properly. Now when we do that, we properly get redirected to the login page, but nothing renders. And that's because in my project, I've set out my routes dynamically, and I have to define them in my routes.ts file in the config. I'm going to go to my routes file, and I'm going to go ahead and copy my home page 3 times, and then I'm just going to make an entry for login and register by changing the path, name, and components respectively. Now when I restart my project, you'll see that it automatically loads the login page properly for me. So now that we have this login page here, there's just a little bit more of cleanup in the code that we have to do. So I'm going to go ahead and inspect my console here. And I don't like these use effect errors showing up. So I'm going to go to my application first. And what I'm going to do is add the ESLint to disable this line and get rid of any other components, imports that I don't need. I'm going to go to my register and login functions and put my set authing right before we call the endpoints. And that'll ensure that our buttons are disabled when we're calling login or register. Then I'm going to go back to the page. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually go ahead and refresh this page. The login console is clear. I'm going to go ahead and just make a fake account here and just put in some random name, email, and some credentials. And you guys can do the same too with whatever backend that you're using. And then once I click register, it redirects me to the login page so I know that I've been registered. So now I'm going to go ahead and log in with the username and password that I put in. And you'll see that it logs me in, and now I'm at my home page, which I couldn't reach before. But if I refresh, you'll see that there was an error parsing my username from local storage. And that's because inside of our application file, I actually got the verify local storage credential inputs backwards. So I just need to switch around my username and token, and then everything should work. So now if we go back to the login page and we enter our username and password, you'll see that we are logged in just fine. And when I refresh the page, forcing us to reconnect to the React components, you'll see that the local storage finds all the things inside of it and that we're authenticated without actually having to log in. So there you have it, guys. There is a project on how to take React and authenticate it with a backend that's using JSON Web Tokens, and also some methods you can use to pass functions around, pass some states around, a little bit of a React strap example, and an example on how to use local storage to keep your saved username and password, but not violating the times that expire on your JSON Web Token. If you guys have any questions, throw them in the comments below. As always, you have access to the repository. And thank you very much for tuning back in. We'll see you in the next video.